This is Steve Perkins, 2014 Indiana Teacher of the Year, and you're listening to the New Teacher Podcast.
The New Teacher Podcast. Get inspired. If you're a new teacher interested in hearing about the latest tips and tricks to inspire you in the classroom, you've come to the right place. The New Teacher Podcast features interviews with award-winning classroom teachers, the latest authors, and educational leaders recognized for their proven teaching techniques and strategies. Hear the stories of their success and failure. To listen to past episodes, view show notes, or to contact us, please visit our website at newteacher.org. Now here's your host, Anthony Arno.
Hello and welcome back to the New Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Arno, and I'm so glad that you can join us here today. This is our third episode, and today we have Steve Perkins, 2014 Indiana State Teacher of the Year. Steve is a high school Latin teacher, which is what makes my talk with him even more interesting. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone for coming down to the NJEA Teachers Convention to say hello to us. We had almost 700 people sign up on our podcast list. Thank you to everyone who stopped by to say hello, from the high school and college students, first-year teachers to all the veteran teachers, including their supportive spouses. If you're not yet on our list, I invite you to join our list at newteacher.org. It's quick and easy and the best way to learn all about the latest releases at the New Teacher Podcast. Before we announce the grand prize winner of the iPad mini contest, I want to remind everyone there's just a few more days left to leave us a review in iTunes for a chance to win a signed copy of Julia Thompson's book, The First Year Teacher's Survival Guide. Julia was our very first guest on the New Teacher Podcast, and you can hear my talk with her in episode number 1. So let's announce our winner, and then we'll go right into my talk with Steve. Hello, this is Anthony Arno calling from the New Teacher Podcast. Is this Diana?
Yes, hi Anthony, how are you?
Hi Diana, how are you doing today?
I'm good.
Good. I want to personally thank you for visiting our booth at the recent NJEA Teachers Convention.
Oh, sure, no problem.
Diana, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, such as what grade do you teach and what subject do you teach?
Sure. This is my first year teaching phys ed for the juniors at St. Joseph's Academy. I actually came to the convention just so I can get a little more experience.
During the 2-day show, we had almost 700 people stop by our booth to join the podcast. You were one of them, and I'm calling to tell you that you are our grand prize winner for an iPad mini.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I hope you'll be able to use this piece of technology in your work as a teacher. As a new teacher, what do you enjoy the most about being a classroom teacher?
I like when the students actually understand what they're learning, especially in phys ed, because I do have a few students that aren't as athletic as the other students in class. So they'll ask so many questions just to understand how to do it, and then when they get it, it's great.
Now, it was at the NJEA convention that we launched the New Teacher Podcast, and our very first guest was Julia Thompson, author of The First Year Teacher's Survival Guide. What was one takeaway that you might have gotten from listening to my talk with Julia?
Well, I definitely liked, when she brought up the book for the secondary, because that's what I'm in right now. So I actually ordered the book so I can actually read it and see, how, I can do it if I'm not, if I'm not in this type of setting.
Diana, thank you again for listening to the New Teacher Podcast, and I want to wish you the very best of luck in your teaching career.
Thank you.
My guest today is the 2014 Indiana Teacher of the Year. He's not your typical teacher when it comes to the content that he teaches. He teaches high school Latin. In addition to teaching Latin, he co-wrote Latin for Dummies. He's a fellow at the Failure Institute, and he can turn any classic rock song, such as Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water, into a new classic when sung in Latin. Please welcome to the New Teacher Podcast, 2014 Indiana Teacher of the Year, Steve Perkins.
Thank you, Anthony. It's good to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the New Teacher Podcast. I appreciate it. My first question is, Steve, let's go back a bit. When you were in fifth grade and you began to get serious about a possible career in education, can you share with our listeners what you did exactly on May 20th, 1980, and reflect back on how that relates to your classroom today?
I can, but only because my mother has kept a piece of paper for that long. I don't know that my memory would really go back that long were it not for that. I grew up in a home of educators. My mom had been a teacher. My dad had been a teacher and then an elementary principal. Number of my mom's family had been teachers as well. So we came from an education family. And early on, I had that sense that I wanted to be a teacher. And what you're referring to is when I was in fifth grade, and Mr. Lang was our teacher, and he really captivated my attention. He was so organized. He just made it seem effortless what he did in the classroom. And got to the end of that school year, and I took out a piece of yellow legal pad paper and made a list of things that I wanted to do when I became a teacher. And of course, that was all based on things I'd seen in Mr. Lang's classroom. And years later, my mom still had it. I don't think she's ever thrown away a single thing that I've ever touched. And so she was able to send that to me. And I actually blogged about it. And that was really the beginning of what has become an incredible journey now, spanning a quarter of a century.
And what were some of the items on that list?
You know, the one I remember the most, and I'd have to go back to look at some of the specifics, but I remember there was no throwing of paper wads in the room and things like that, coming prepared to class and those sorts of things. And I think what he did, obviously teaching fifth grade, he taught all the subjects, and he just not only made each one come alive, but he made his classroom experience just really flow. And so you always knew what you were supposed to be doing, where you were supposed to be doing it, and when. And that really struck me as a very, very early pre-educator and thinking about how I wanted to construct my own classroom.
Right. Now, I'm looking at that list now, Steve. You had stuff such as have manila folders and allow no comic books. How has that changed today in 2015?
Manila folders have become folders on our phones and on our tablets.
Steve, do you have a personal story about a teacher that might have inspired you as a student? And what do you remember the most about them?
It's interesting, Anthony. I remember every single teacher I've had from kindergarten through graduate school. And
wow.
I've in talks I've given, I have enumerated the influences of a great many of them, and I can spot distinct influences from a wide number of those teachers in what I do in the classroom today. I think of Miss Rank, who was my high school Latin teacher for a couple of years. She retired at the end of my junior year to marry her high school sweetheart. She had never gotten married, and she retired to marry him. And she brought the love of Latin to me and really put me on the path for wanting to teach this language. Her successor, Marcine Farley, who is still teaching. She's now teaching in Illinois, and she and I are great friends and colleagues. I see things that she did with us with regard to the Junior Classical League, which is a national organization of Latin clubs across the country. Things that she did in organizing that experience, that affects what we do. I'm sitting in my classroom right now, and I'm looking at one very long wall that is completely filled with ribbons earned by our students at past state Latin conventions. That was because of Marcine and her influence in getting us into club. And I think of Mr. Goldstein, my sixth grade teacher, who sparked in me a desire for creative writing that has lasted to this day. And so really I could go through every level, every school, and really every year of my educational background and find those influences.
And so when was the moment that you decided you wanted to become a teacher?
It really crystallized my junior year. I was sitting in Miss Rank's Latin class, and I'd always known that I wanted to be a teacher. Like I say, my parents were in education. I had that sense growing up. And it absolutely clicked in her class. I just love the grammar. I know that's a strange thing to say, but I love the history, of course, love the mythology and all of that. And I distinctly remember sitting in her class and saying, this is the subject that I want to teach. And I went off to undergraduate and had some professors who said, you're going to rethink that. You're going to want to go on and do the PhD and teach at the university level. And I did get my master's in classics, but I deliberately did not pursue the PhD because I wanted to be in the secondary classroom.
And as a Latin teacher, what type of reaction do you get when you announce that you're a Teacher of the Year in Indiana and you teach basically, I'm sorry to say this, a dead language?
Sure. And of course, what we mean linguistically when we talk about a dead language is that it's not a language that is taught to someone as their first language or as their native language. We have no one learning that as their first language from the cradle. And the response I always get is, oh, I didn't know they still taught Latin. And so you kind of laugh that off. And then you explain the situation of classics in the United States. Latin enrollment has grown. I teach at one of the largest high schools in the state of Indiana. We are over 3,700 students. We have 7 languages, and Latin is the third largest behind Spanish and French. So there is I don't know if you just call it a resurgence, but certainly you find areas in the country where there's a very strong presence of classical studies, the study of Latin and Greek culture, and then the particular languages of Latin and Greek. There are quite a number of places where you find that, and not just at the private schools. We're a public school, and you certainly find that across the country.
Now, looking at your blog and your website, I'm quite impressed with all the neat things you've done as a Latin teacher. But I want you to talk to our listeners who might be first-year teachers. What is one thing a new teacher can do tomorrow in their classroom to become more effective as a teacher, whether they're a first-year teacher or they're a Latin teacher like yourself?
I really think you've got to forget yourself. And that's one of the toughest things for a new teacher to do, certainly in the first couple of years. When you're starting out in your student teaching experience, prior to that, you are very self-focused, and that's understandable. You're suddenly standing on a stage, you're in front of people, and suddenly you're thinking, where do I put my hands? Do I stand? Do I sit? If I got my back turned to the class when I'm writing, can they hear me? You're thinking all those self-critical questions are running through your head, and that's appropriate because you're not used to it yet. You haven't gotten comfortable in your own teacher's skin. The downside is that you're not focused on the students as much. And the quicker that you can put yourself away and realize that you are there for them and that they are actual human beings. And that's one of the things that it seems like a truism, but it's something we really do forget. These children are somebody's sons and daughters.
Absolutely.
Brothers and sisters. These are human beings, the same as you. And they've got the same hopes and the dreams and the fears and the worries and the concerns. And when you can begin to relate to them as equals in terms of human beings, then that's going to make all the difference in your classroom environment. Now, you're not equals in terms of knowledge, and you shouldn't be, or why did they hire you? You should know more than they do on a particular subject. That's why they hired you to teach that subject. But you're not above them in terms of being a fellow human being. And so I think the quicker you can put yourself aside and interact with them really as equals in that regard, the quicker your classroom environment becomes one where learning is enjoyable and you really are moving together on what I have often termed the shared journey of discovery that is education.
Right, absolutely. Now, Steve, the day you found out that you won Teacher of the Year in Indiana, they surprised you during your class, and they captured a beautiful picture of you embracing your 2 children, which I just loved seeing on your website. And then I saw some video, and it looks like you're in complete shock and you're both laughing and crying. What was that moment like for you?
It was absolutely extraordinary. It was in October of 2013. We announce in the fall the Indiana Teacher of the Year for the following year. And we just had our first period class had just gotten started. We had our warm-up activity underway, and I turned around, and my door is opening, and in comes our state superintendent, our children, my wife, and media.
Lots of
and,
media.
and lots of media, all the Indianapolis television stations and print media as well. And all of a sudden you realize, well, okay, something's going on here. And of course, I knew that had gone through the top 10 and was top 3. And so I realized what was happening there. And they announced it. My class cheered. There's all this uproar. And then I was told, we need to take you out of the classroom. There's a reception for you. And my first response, and this was absolutely genuine, I looked to my district superintendent and I said, do you have a class cover? Because my immediate, and that was absolutely genuine.
Always
my
thinking like
response,
a teacher.
Thinking like a teacher. My thought was, but we're just started the warm up activity, and they're going to need some guidance here, So that she assured me, yes, there had been a class cover obtained. And then as I left my classroom, the hallways of our school were lined with students, and they're cheering, they're clapping. Many of whom I did not know, they were not my students in a Latin class. And they're cheering and they're clapping as we make our way through the hallways to this room where there was going to be a reception and interviews with the media and so forth. And that was an extraordinary moment. I still walk those hallways and that staircase every day as I come in from the parking lot.
What a great
memory.
I
often think through that moment, yes.
So how has your life changed since being announced a state teacher of the year and carrying out the responsibilities basically as an ambassador for all teachers of the state of Indiana? How has your life changed?
It's changed in wonderful ways. It's certainly gotten busier, and certainly in the 2014-2015 school year, that was really what we call our year of service. So all the celebration is past, and now you really kind of get down to work and get opportunities to do things in the broader educational field. And I would say it's changed in two ways. It has reminded me of what I always knew, and I think we all know, but we easily forget, and that is there's an educational world beyond the four walls of my classroom. When you shut that door, it is so easy for those four walls to become the length and breadth of your world. And you forget about research. You forget about policy. You forget about politics. You forget about other colleagues. You forget about the university level. All those other aspects speaking into this larger educational puzzle, if you will, suddenly you get reconnected with that. And then you start gravitating to certain areas. Certain teachers of the year find themselves more politically inclined. Some find themselves more administratively inclined and move in that direction. And so you get reminded of that broader world. And then the second thing is you get introduced to some of the finest educators around your state and across the country.
Right. Now, as state teacher of the year, you went to the White House to receive your award. What was it like meeting the President of the United States?
Unbelievable. It had rained, and that's why we did not have the reception in the Rose Garden. And so it was held in the East Room, and we met him individually in the Blue Room, and each of us got our individual photographs taken with the president. And you're standing there in the room next door, you're in line, and you're looking through this doorway, and there's this man that you have seen on television, the President of the United States, just a few feet away. And there's this Marine Guard who is announcing each teacher of the year from his or her state. And one by one, you're getting closer, and you're like, "Oh my goodness, this is really happening." And so each of us had thought of a little something, that we wanted to say. And so I got introduced. It's Indiana Teacher of the Year, and so I took a message from my students. President Obama's last name, Obama, when spelled backwards, is amabo. And that's the Latin verb that means I will love. It's first person singular, future indicative active. And so I told him that, and he had this big laugh, and he says, "Well, how about that?"
Oh, how cool is that?
Oh, it was wonderful. And then we moved from there into the East Room, where Sean McComb was announced as the 2014 National Teacher of the Year. An incredible experience there, and partly, again, as someone who's in classics and has a deep connection with history, to realize you're standing in the East Room, and how many announcements have been made from that room. When
Wow.
President Obama announced that we had finally gotten Osama bin Laden,
Wow.
that announcement was made from that room, and you're standing in that room, and you realize the history that you are now a part of is extraordinary.
What an honor. Wow. Let's talk to our new teachers now. What type of advice would you give to new teachers when you look back at your career as a teacher to a mistake that you might have made, and what did you learn from that mistake?
Well, certainly the thing to learn, I'll start off right away, is don't be afraid to scrap an idea if it's not working. And I learned that one from stories told about my dad. He told it, and my mom told it. My dad had been a sixth grade teacher, and they told the story that he had had some science project going on where his students were going to build a working volcano. And I don't know, they went on at it for some length of time, maybe a couple of weeks, and it just wasn't working. And he finally had to scrap it and say, you know what, guys, we're just going to stop this now. To do this anymore would be counterproductive. And I distinctly remember that being taught and told many times as I was growing up as a great example. Sometimes you just have to recognize, and maybe you have to go back and retool. You may come back at the next year, but at some point you've got to recognize, hey, this is not working. Let's just get rid of it. Several years ago, I had this wonderful idea in my mind that all the Latin classes were going to blog. And I set up these blogs for each level.
Sounds
And
like
it
a
was,
great idea. What
oh,
happened?
yeah. Well, honestly, a couple of things. I was expecting a level of linguistic sophistication at each level that they just weren't ready for. My standards I had for first year, they weren't ready for that yet. What I had for second year, they weren't ready for that yet. So first, I had the standards set too high. Secondly, I misread students' involvement with blogging. Students didn't blog. Now, they did other things. Now, this, I think, is even before some of the current social media. But blogging, as I came to find out, was something that adults did. It was news people, it was scholars, and that was my world. And I'm going, oh, yeah, this is great stuff. Well, kids just didn't do that. It wasn't a method that they used. So after a little while of that, and oh wait, we went on that for a while. Finally, I had to scrap. I said, guys, this just isn't working, and we just recognized that. And so I kept the blog addresses, and I think we ended up using them for something else. And rather than blogging in Latin, we actually used them, I think, to talk about classics and some other things. But again, it was one of those recognitions where I misread my audience. That just wasn't their interest, and I also misread their skill level. And so now, could I have forced it, or could I have tweaked it and made the actual thing work the following year in Latin? Probably we could have done something, but I'd come to the conclusion, especially because that wasn't their interest, that just wasn't worth pursuing again.
Right. So if you're a new teacher and you're in front of the classroom, don't be afraid to scrap an idea. And
Absolutely.
especially, even if you're in the middle of an observation, no matter how uncomfortable it might feel, if you're teaching a particular lesson and something just isn't going right, there's nothing that says you have to go on to the next step. In fact,
Absolutely.
slow down and look and see whether or not your students are getting it, and what can you do to ensure they're getting it before you move on to the next step.
And if that's happening during an observation, any evaluator worth his or her salt is going to see that for what it is, which is the mark of a professional.
Right.
No evaluator would mark that down. If they did, then they shouldn't be an evaluator.
Right, exactly. And as a new teacher, you probably feel like, but I have to get to this step, that step, and the next
Right.
step. Hey, Steve, you're a fellow at the Failure Institute. I never even knew such an institution existed. Tell us about the goals and missions of this organization.
The Failure Institute is a new organization launched just this fall or late summer by a friend of mine named Ron Brumbarger here in Indianapolis. And Ron is quite the entrepreneur. He currently owns and operates an IT firm, and he's always looking for something new. And Ron latched onto the idea that everyone has failed, and that all the most successful people whether it's in business, government, or education, own their failures, acknowledge their failures, are not ashamed of their failures, and have learned from their failures to become better.
Absolutely.
So Ron's perspective was, why don't we pull together people from different walks of life? Again, government, higher ed, K-12, business, and so forth. Pull some of these folks together, leaders in these areas, and ask them, how have you failed? And for us to be able to have an opportunity to write on our failures, to discuss our failures, to discuss what we've learned from our failures, and then to make those lessons, those writings, available on the internet for people who want really to learn. And so you're getting ready to try something in business, and you want to say, well, I want to know how have people failed at this particular thing so that I don't make the same mistakes. And you might come to the Failure Institute and see what someone has written on that and say, hey, that's really good stuff. I see what happened. I see now how I could navigate around that and not have that same failure.
How do you deal with your students if one of them failed an assignment, a test, or a project? How would you respond to that?
I've told them a wrong answer on a test, let's use a test as an example of an assessment, a wrong answer tells me exactly one thing. It tells me that you got it wrong. It doesn't tell me why. I don't know why you got it wrong. Did you get it wrong because you failed to study? Did you get it wrong because you've got test anxiety and you froze up? Did you get it wrong because you genuinely didn't understand the question? Did you get it wrong because you understood the question but didn't remember the answer? Did you genuinely not understand the concept? Were you hungry because you hadn't eaten the last night or that morning? Was there some social situation going on in your family or elsewhere? I know none of the reasons why you got that particular question wrong. All I know is you got it wrong.
So what would you do?
So any follow, that's what you have to do. You have to follow up and say, okay, we need to talk. Now, I think in the lower levels, elementary and some middle school, I think that's a little more teacher directed. So the teacher is a little bit more in terms of the initiating. How did you get this wrong? Why? What happened here? And as you move up into the high school, you want to equip the student to perform that self-analysis. Why did I get this wrong? And as I always tell my students, you can con anyone. You can con your parents. You can con your coach. You can't con yourself. Now, you know why you didn't get it wrong, or why you didn't get it right.
Right, yes.
You know why. It's because you didn't study. You know that. And if that's the issue, guess what? You got to study, or change your study habits, or change your method. You know, if you didn't understand that concept, then guess what? You need to come talk to me. And that's when you start making yourself available and say, hey, I'm here at this time, I'm here at that time, and you've got to come talk to me. And I think at the high school level, you really want them to perform that analysis. But there has to be some analysis afterward, because simply saying you got something wrong or I got a 72 out of 100, that really is meaningless. That number is meaningless without that sort of analysis afterward as to the why.
Right. What is one book you could recommend to our new teacher listeners that would help them become a better teacher?
I will tell you I've got a book that I recommend to a lot of people. In fact, I've got two. The one is on the practical side, and the one is on the theoretical side. On the practical side, there is a book by Liz Wiseman and Elise Foster, and it's called The Multiplier Effect. And the subtitle is Tapping the Genius Inside Our Schools. And it is a marvelous book for any teacher who is thinking, I want to be more than just what I am in the classroom. And I'm not saying more in the sense of denigrating that. Obviously, there's nothing more important than what a teacher does in the classroom, but more in terms of additional. I want to have a larger role within the field of education while teaching in my classroom. Well, this book really talks about that, and it's good for administrators. It's great for school boards. It's about how we really tap into the genius, as the title says, that's already into our schools. The other book, and I highly recommend it, although I'll give a warning, it is a challenging read. It's called Lessons of the Masters, and it's by George Steiner. And anyone who's ever read any of George Steiner's stuff, he's out of the University of Chicago, knows that he loves to use big words. And if he can use 15 words where someone else would use 3, he will use 15. He is quite an interesting stylist in terms of his writing. But he really gets at what I think is the core and the essence of the teacher-student relationship. He taps into that humanity. He looks at it across time and across cultures. And in many ways, what he describes has little to do with the almost machine-like process that we see in some of our schools today. I apologize, there's a bell.
That's okay.
And that bell is over now.
And what is one internet resource that can really help a new teacher in the classroom?
I was thinking about this recently. I've talked with some students who are in some of our schools of ed at some of our universities around Indiana. I'm a big fan of Twitter, and that raises some eyebrows with some folks who think that Twitter is only about following your favorite sports figure or rock band. Twitter has really become a significant educational tool, certainly for me, but for many, many teachers. One reason is I've set up one of my Twitter accounts to really be only education. So I'm seeing news feeds, I'm seeing articles, and that's how I'm getting some sifting for my reading and things I want to do to keep up in the profession. So I'm seeing some of the best stuff come through my Twitter feed. But even more importantly is the Twitter chat, where hundreds of people may get online at a particular time, a particular day, and using a certain hashtag are discussing some particular topic. So, for example, Brian Stabnick out of New York, he hosts AP Lit Chat at 9 o'clock on Sunday evenings,
right,
with the hashtag AP Lit Chat. And anybody who's teaching AP literature, and even though I don't teach English literature, as a Latin teacher, I'm interested in that, and so sometimes I'll go and check out that chat. That is a great way for scholars and educators across the country, and indeed the world, to engage in meaningful professional development on their own time, and it's not being moderated by somebody else. It's not being something rammed down your throat. This is what we want you to get. It's teacher driven, and of course, that's always the best stuff.
And how can our listeners follow you on Twitter?
My Twitter handle is intoy, INTOY 2014, intoy 2014.
Okay. What's the best thing about being a classroom teacher, Steve?
The kids. No matter what is going on outside my door, what's going on in terms of politics, what's going on in terms of policy, what's going on out in the world. When you close that door and suddenly you're in your element and the students are there, you're engaged with them, you're engaged with matters that truly matter. You're seeing their talents come to life, their growth and development. There's simply nothing like it.
Absolutely. Do you have a favorite educational quote to inspire our new teachers? Maybe in Latin first?
Sure. Definitely get asked that one from time to time. And a quotation I've been using actually since I was in high school for a variety of things, and we use it as an anchor piece for the community service work that our Latin students do. The Roman orator Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BC, delivered a speech in defense of a Greek poet named Archias. And in section 12 of that speech, he said, "Ceteros pudeat si quita se litteris abdederunt, ut nihil exeis possent, neque ad communum adferre fructum, neque in aspectum lucemque profere." Which translates basically, people should be ashamed of themselves if they spend all of their time in learning and never bring forth anything for the public good or into the light to be seen by others. And that quotation, as I say, has formed the foundation for our community service work, and our students do quite a bit of that, because it's not enough just to know that Caesar fought in Gaul or that President Obama's name spelled backwards as a future tense verb. It's about taking the things that we've learned about the incredible civilizations of Greece and Rome and their language, their literature, their art, and so forth, and taking that into the world today to keep this so-called dead language alive.
You're listening to the New Teacher Podcast, and our guest today is Steve Perkins, the 2014 Indiana Teacher of the Year. Steve, are you ready for the final period before the bell?
I am.
Okay. Morning person or night owl?
Morning person.
Mac or PC?
PC all the way.
Favorite book from your childhood?
Favorite book from childhood was a biography, Pilot Jack Knight.
First paying job?
Summer school teacher while I was in college.
One television show that you try to watch every week?
Longmire.
Last music download or song playing on your iPod?
Definitely something from the hair band Striper or Whitesnake.
One famous person you would love to invite for dinner, either living or dead?
The British poet Alexander Pope.
It's an unexpected snow day in Indiana. What are you going to do with this new day off from school?
Writing.
The next item on your bucket list?
The next item on my bucket list, actually, I just crossed off this summer. Since I was in high school, I'd longed to own a Mustang. And we finally got one this summer, and
cool
I'm
beans.
driving around in a Mustang. And so right now, Daddy has crossed off the last thing on his bucket list, so I've got to make a new list.
Now, is that an antique or a new?
It is new. We talked about whether to go with a classic, and we wanted to be a daily driver and something that the whole family could ride in. And so we got a 2014.
Wow, cool beans. And there's the final bell. How can our listeners get in touch with you, Steve?
Certainly through Twitter. I would encourage them to check out my blog, which is similar title, intoy2014.blogspot.com.
Okay, you've been listening again to the New Teacher Podcast, and I would like to thank Steve again for being our guest today, talking with us about all the different activities he does as a Latin teacher and Indiana Teacher of the Year. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been a pleasure, Anthony. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again to Steve, and the next time I pass a Mustang, I'll be sure to look and see if it's you, Steve. Our guest next week is third grade teacher Sarah Reed, 2015 Kentucky State Teacher of the Year. Sarah is one of several State Teachers of the Year featured in the current issue of Instructor magazine. Well, that's our third show, and thank you for listening. This is the New Teacher Podcast, and I'm your host, Anthony Arno. Be well.